Daily Bible Time, Dominic Steele. Good morning. It is a Thursday morning, the 28th of October 2021, and just over 504 years ago, the 31st of October 1517, that was the day that Martin Luther nailed his thesis to the cathedral door in Wittenberg, Germany, kick-starting the Protestant Reformation. Luther, Catholic priest working in Germany, Wittenberg, just to the south of Berlin, he was lecturing in the university, teaching theology there. But Father Luther knew that he wasn't good enough for God. He knew that deep in his heart. He knew he wasn't righteous. He saw that God was righteous, but that he was unrighteous. He'd been lecturing through Paul's letter to the Romans, and he would have explained sentences to his students like this one, Romans chapter 3, verse 10. As it is written, there's no one righteous, not even one. No one who understands, no one who seeks God. God was the perfect one. Luther would have seen and told his students, in terms of being acceptable to God, in and of ourselves, none of us are acceptable. We know that. We know there's no perfect person. We know we're all flawed. Luther, he says he lived as a monk without reproach, but before God, he saw himself as a sinner. He couldn't believe that God was pleased with his efforts. If you think in our society, the prostitute, the drug dealer, they're down the bottom of the mine shaft on earth. Whereas the social worker, they're at the top of the mine shaft. Martin Luther, he was a priest at the top of the mine shaft, but it's like God is out in Mars. And there's no way, whether you're the prostitute at the bottom of the mine shaft or the social worker at the top of the mine, you can't get to Mars. And Luther desperately wanted to be accepted by God. And he was angry with God because he could see all the righteousness of God out there, and he knew he was essentially condemned by it. And so he hated the righteousness of God. Now, it was over months, perhaps years of lecturing, that Luther gradually, little by little, departed from the accepted mainstream consensus of the time. And it was just one step at a time, but he gradually came to what for the time was a radical understanding of what the Apostle Paul had written in his letter to the Romans. Key sentence for Luther, written by the Apostle Paul, Romans chapter 1, sentence 17. In the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith, Romans 1:17. And Luther came to see that the gospel, the good news of God, is a revelation about the righteousness of God, a letting one know about the righteousness of God. And up until now, he'd seen the righteousness of God as a statement about the character of God or God's purity. Now he starts to see the righteousness of God as a statement about the activity of God, that God is acting to make people righteous. And the line, the righteous will live by faith, in saying that those made righteous by God, those declared righteous by God, will access the activity of God by putting their faith, trust into God's saving activity. And Luther says, I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely by faith. It was like this key had unlocked the door. It was a key to understanding what had been right there in the scriptures, but had been ignored, overlooked for hundreds of years. Perhaps even better, it was like Luther had taken out a paint scraper, and as one might scrape barnacles off the bottom of a ship, Luther had scraped away centuries of theological distortion. Up until that point, Luther had seen that he'd been struggling and failing to be good enough for God, but he realizes God declares him righteous, and he trusts him. For Luther, it was like scales falling from his eyes. So for him, this righteousness by faith, those words have become the sweetest words. He saw that he was unrighteous, that Jesus was righteous, that Paul was writing the letter to the Romans, that we are made righteous, for all have sinned, all have fallen short of the glory of God, and are, Romans 3:23, justified freely by his grace. How do we access that grace? It's not by working hard, it's not by being good, it's not by keeping the law. Romans 3, sentence 27. On what principle? On that of observing the law? No. On that of faith. We maintain a man is justified by faith, apart from observing the law. And Paul goes on to write that it's always been that way. Paul writes that this is God's way of relating to people, that it was like that even with Abraham. Romans chapter 4, what shall we say that Abraham our forefather discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Paul says it's not what we do, it's that we have faith alone in what God has done in making us righteous. And how does Martin Luther feel about the righteousness of God? Luther says, I love it. For trusting in what God has done, it is the gate to paradise. That the unrighteous sinner may stand in the presence of God because his unrighteousness is lost in the infinite abyss of the love, the righteousness, and the mercy of God. And it is that beautiful concept of justification by faith or faith alone that Protestants celebrate on Reformation Sunday. Thanks for joining us on Daily Bible Time today. I'll see you tomorrow and we'll attempt to spell out some of